Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Emergency Planning, Financial Implications and Considerations. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Colleen Rozillis, Senior Manager with our Moss Adams Advisory Services Group, and Emily Hayes, Manager with our Moss Adams Advisory Services Group. With that, I'll turn it over to Colleen to get us started.
Thanks, Pam. So I'll start out by just going through our agenda today and give you a quick overview. We're going to cover business continuity, the difference between continuity and preparedness planning, financial preparedness in particular, and then provide a framework for assessing financial preparedness, and we'll wrap up with some resources for you and a Q&A. So we'll kick things off with a poll just to see who's here, and I'll give you a few minutes to do that. All right, so let's take a look. Okay, so lots of nonprofit government folks here today, quite a few higher ed, so great to see. Really excited that you all are here with us. So we'll try to tailor a little bit of our content to who's here. So we'll start out with just planning and preparedness and kind of a general overview. There are a number of ways to approach preparedness. So on the left, you'll see a hierarchy of 3 different types of planning for emergency preparedness. At the top, we've got strategic preparedness planning. So that's really driven by policy. So we think about that as kind of your board or your leadership. It's establishing the priorities for preparedness, but it's really not getting into the weeds of the what. It's more of why we're doing what we're doing. In the middle, we've got operational planning. So we'd expect that to occur at a managerial level. We're assigning roles and responsibilities. We're really thinking about the tasks that we have to accomplish, how we're all going to work together, and the steps that we're going to take. And then at the bottom, we have tactical planning. So that pre-identifies the requirements for how we're really going to respond at the task level. And then we can use that to help to identify the gaps. Another way to look at preparedness planning is the cycle on the right. And yes, it is a cycle. You'll hear many times we're never done planning. We never want your preparedness plan to sit on the shelf. So we start out with prevention. Prevention activities decrease the likelihood of an incident occurring. Then we go to mitigation activities. So mitigation would decrease the impact of a negative event on your organization. Response planning is really identifying the steps to respond. Recovery then are the steps to continue your core operations. That's kind of the mode that a lot of folks are in actually today in our current situation. And then we've got restoration, which is something that I bet a lot of us are thinking about, which is how do we get back to normal? And once we get back to normal, we want to start that cycle over and think about, okay, how can we prevent the next situation from occurring? So when we think about business continuity and preparedness, another lens to think about it is really contingency planning. What we're thinking about are all of the potential things that could happen, all of the contingencies in our operations, and how we can be more resilient as an organization. So this has many different elements. Most of our clients, I would say, have some, but not all of these contingency plans or elements in place. I'm just going to point out a couple. So disaster recovery, our clients have been increasingly focused on disaster recovery. How do we get our IT back online quickly and safely? Likewise, I think with respect to information system contingency, we're all learning a lot about the adequacy of our technology right now and kind of what we need to actually work in a truly remote environment. And when a core system goes down, what can we do about that? In addition, we're also learning about kind of the how, when, and why we communicate to our staff, to our stakeholders, to our community. I know our higher ed clients are really experiencing a lot of that with communicating to their student populations. What's the right way to push out crisis communications, and what are the different ways that we can talk with our community so that we can make sure that everyone is prepared? Our focus today is on business continuity, which really asks how will we be able to continue operating under a broad range of circumstances. So continuity planning includes the steps that support critical business operations, identifies essential functions, and how they'll be performed. Business continuity is a piece of comprehensive emergency management, so there's also emergency response and crisis management, as well as other types of disaster recovery. And these should all work together in concert to help you be prepared. Business continuity and these other plans also describe how timely resumption of normal operations will occur, which is very important to how we actually get kind of back on track. So I wanted to just note, Emily and I gave this presentation last summer at a conference, and there were so many questions at this moment talking about, okay, what is actually essential, and how do we drill down to that? And I would say that all of us now are actually really experiencing this moment of saying, okay, well, we know what's essential in our organization. We know what's kind of essential in our lives and essential to our local economies, and we've really learned that. So my guess is we're probably not going to get a lot of Q&A on this area because we've gotten that crash course in essential functions since March. But I do want to note essential functions, they're not going to be the same in every organization. The focus of our presentation today is on those essential functions really common to financial functions, which we're going to cover later in this presentation.
So as Colleen, mentioned, this piece that we're experiencing kind of live right now about essential functions should really be driven by those earlier phases, that strategic and operational planning. Ideally, we're going to use this unexpected opportunity that the global pandemic has provided to really define and document, capture the reasoning why different essential functions are so important. This is a time to engage your stakeholders to really evaluate the value of a program or a service, and really drawing it back to, why do we do what we need to do? So a key piece is to make sure that every time you go through this process, that it's an iterative process, and really think about the prioritization. What is the recovery sequence? How would you prioritize each of the essential functions that you are hopefully currently identifying? There are a lot of different areas to consider, both in the identification and the prioritization phase. Really thinking about across the board, people, the premises, the places, and the space and the equipment that we need, the processes, the dependencies that we have on IT, the documentation. Is it clear how the processes go? The systems and communication, how are we communicating around both internally and externally? Our providers include both internal dependencies as well as thinking about our external dependency. We're really learning how valuable Skype and Zoom is right now, I think, in a lot of different situations. The impact of the supply chain disruptions as well, when we're not able to immediately order and have our 2-day Amazon delivery. That, it's really an important piece to identify who those are. And lastly, just thinking about our profile of, overall, who are our key stakeholders, thinking about what are our legal considerations for compliance, and then if there are particularly vulnerable groups that we serve, who is going to be potentially impacted if a service is not completed. All of this planning that we're talking about, we really want to emphasize the importance of using risk-based planning. So I want to just highlight the difference between uncertainty and risk. Risk planning, we talk about what we know, what are the threats that we can identify, and we then can develop our mitigation strategies as a result. Uncertainty is we don't know what we don't know what's going to happen, and we're all experiencing that in a real way these days, because we just don't have a lot of certainty about what the next day or the next week or the next month will look like. But again, thinking about what is the downstream impact if you're not able to deliver on these mission essential or essential functions, and prioritizing which areas have the most risk if they do not continue to function. We're all, I think, as well, considering new recovery timelines. Often this has been in the past one of the hardest pieces to get folks to think about. We often think about that emergency incident response and tying it back to, just a few days. But now we're thinking, I think all of us, how to continue to think about our new normal is many months now. We're talking in maybe the years. So expanding our horizon to new lengths. Finally, some of the common pitfalls we see continuity plans that are developed without a business impact analysis. And a key part of that is really not just identifying the essential functions, then identifying the dependencies and the inputs that are required. So what are the resources, the people, the financing that is needed for each of those essential functions, and then assessing and prioritizing that downstream impact if services are disrupted. We also see a lot of very large, clunky, unreadable documents come out of this. No one wants to look at it. They aren't actionable or flexible for these changing times when we're in crisis. Another pitfall is developed and maintained in isolation. Someone gets assigned and stuck with just, here's a document, you should just create it, it's a project, one and done, checkbox. No, we really want continuity plans to be an iterative, multidisciplinary process that we really engage everyone in it. And so if you could structure it to institutionalize continuity planning, then you can use it in testing and exercises as well, which is the final pitfall of where we often see some roadblocks.
Thanks, Emily. So in this section, we're going to go through a couple of ways to think about financial preparedness from really a framework perspective. We define financial preparedness really kind of thinking about, okay, what are the functions that might impact our organization? When we sit down with a client and we talk about business continuity, that's really the first place that we start, or what are the areas that could most be impacted by this particular scenario? So there are three major areas of potential financial impact to an organization: property, operational, and human. And when you consider the impact on each of these areas, then you can begin to identify gaps and how to mitigate them. Many of these areas are not isolated, and so you're going to see some overlap as we go through this framework. And as you kind of think about these areas in your organization, you'll also see quite a bit of overlap. In fact, I could probably make the human circle just cover the rest of the Venn diagram because everything involves people here. But we'll start with property. So property impacts, when we think about business continuity, they can range from damage, like a fire or a flood, to kind of the less tangible impacts we're seeing from COVID. For example, many of our government clients have had to procure laptops right away and establish VPNs and equip remote workers for the first time. And so that's a huge property impact, and that's going to be a property impact going forward when you have all these additional assets and have to figure out how we're going to store them or how we're going to work with our technology assets going forward in the future if we've got kind of twice as many, if we've got desktops and laptops. We've also seen organizations really wrestle with physical records during this time, especially kind of smaller organizations, small nonprofits, especially if you don't have an HR system. You're going to have to send people into the office to access personal records. We've heard of quite a few clients over the last couple of weeks having to send folks in to mask up to go through personnel records, and ideally we wouldn't be doing that during an emergency. I also wanted to note, kind of related to facilities, something that's come up quite a bit for those of you in higher education who are on the webinar today. So you now have really significant facilities impacts because you've got campuses running really on skeleton crews. You have many buildings and your vehicles sitting unused. And then when we resume operations, the offices, the labs, the housing, the classrooms may look very different. And so really thinking about those potential impacts long-term, what are the gaps that we might need to fill in those areas are a huge area of discussion right now. With respect to operations, pretty much every area of operations can be impacted by an emergency. One area that's been a particular impact during this pandemic for our public and not-for-profit sector has really been partnerships. So if, for example, your organization depends on another for funding or program delivery, we see lots of colleges and universities and nonprofits paired with state government or federal government, for example. If that agency is furloughed or shut down, or working with only their essential workforce, thinking about, can you continue to deliver your programs and services? Do you have reserves to be able to make up for the difference while those folks are furloughed? We're going to cover purchasing in depth later, but I just want to note it's probably the least reliable area in an emergency. Everything from office supplies and toilet paper, right, to kind of big needs, thinking about your supply chain, where you get your goods that help you to operate. And then finally, I'm going to talk about human impact. So in an emergency, the impact on your staff, your board, your leadership, and people that you serve can really be unpredictable. And there are many impacts of that. I think, we're all kind of experiencing right now working parents. If schools are closed, what does that mean to your human operations? What does that mean in terms of being able to have folks be accessible and available during normal working hours and not having, a toddler impacting any very important service delivery? I also wanted to just give an example. A couple of years ago, we worked with a county in California before and then during a really devastating wildfire. And in the wildfire, more than 150 of their employees lost their homes. And so the impact then across the county of folks who might not even be able to live there, kind of close to the office, to be able to work in their jobs, who might have lost their work-provided technology to be able to do something, was pretty significant. And so being able to stand up operations when your employees might not have the tools and ability to do that can be very challenging.
So as Colleen mentioned, we see a lot of different areas, and we don't want to necessarily go down the road of trying to plan for every possible event. We would just kind of drive ourselves crazy and, never be finished. So what we suggest for continuity planning is to really think about prioritizing planning and your risk mitigation efforts around the top likely scenarios for your organization. So again, it kind of ties back to that risk-based planning. Really think about how can we engage a multidisciplinary group of folks, both internal and external, to make sure that when we're planning, we are including useful analysis both on timing and of likelihood and impact. So thinking not just in a financial department analysis, but making sure when the finance department does their risk-based analysis of their essential services, that is then integrated with a kind of across the organization to really think about how does each piece come together, and how does a disruption in one area really flow and maybe impact others. So if ideally you would be able to have a budget model that allows for some scenario analysis to give you that perspective of, if we lose X amount of revenue, what does that look like? What does that give us? And we're experiencing that right now. And so if we don't have that, that capability, this is the time to really think about how do we develop the tools and data that we need to explore these different scenarios, because again, there's a lot of uncertainty, and we can just plan as best as we can based on what we know. We are in the midst of a very specific hazard, but we don't want to lose sight of the other types of incidents that might occur. Hopefully not on top of the pandemic, but it's likely to happen. So if we have planning events where we talk through specific hazards, that can help folks have a grounding in specific scenarios and tease out the details of different potential impacts. So natural disasters, those are often what we see. We do a lot of work here on the West Coast, and earthquakes are always the one that jump right to the front of my mind, at least. The human hazards include both, active shooters. Unfortunately, those kind of events that are driven by malicious actors who are trying to maybe scam or defraud the organization in some way. And finally, thinking about the technology piece as well, IT disaster recovery and business continuity are very closely linked. They are separate disciplines, but they are intertwined. And so they should be kind of considered and coordinated in any circumstance where you're thinking about a hazard-specific planning. All right, Colleen.
And one of the core ways that we can also think about financial preparedness, really down to just dollars and cents, is to look at your reserves. They might be formally defined. They might be simply cash on hand. I will say that we do a couple of financial reserve policy projects a year for firm clients, and back in March, I heard from probably 4 or 5 of them that just said, I'm so happy that we put a policy in place, because all of a sudden we have to really think about our reserves and our cash on hand. Each organization should have an operating reserve. We're tempted to spend all the money that we have every year, but we really need to be prepared for things like we might have an HVAC system failure. We might have to buy 500 laptops because there is a global pandemic. There might be a government shutdown. It's really best practice for us to put something in place. It should be unrestricted. So I know that, in higher ed and nonprofit and even in the government space, we might have a lot of cash on hand, but actually defining what's unrestricted so that we can have emergency authority to spend it on everything is a really important exercise to go through. Recommendations for operating reserves can be all over the place. In the higher education, it might be more like 6 months because cash flow can fluctuate pretty broadly throughout the academic year. A government or a private entity might have more stable revenues kind of month to month and can have less cash on hand. Personal example, I'm on the board of a not-for-profit and we get some of our funding from the federal government. So we put in a reserve policy in place last year, and then just a couple months after that, we were faced with a 6-week government shutdown and a question about whether or not we would receive any federal funds for that year. And our reserve policy was 4 to 6 months. And once we were actually staring that possibility in the face, 4 to 6 months really did not seem like a lot. And the Finance Committee discussions were quite interesting about this. So I would encourage you to talk at the leadership level, and if you have a finance committee, a board or council, about really what the appropriate reserve level is, understanding that we're currently in a time where many organizations have unpredictable cash flow. Capital reserves are also a good idea, especially if you operate a campus or you own more than one building. We tend to not set aside money for repairs. It's just kind of not very exciting to do that. But emergencies are really always more expensive than what we plan for. So lots of organizations have started to set aside some funds for capital reserves. We can think about that both for maintenance, but also when we think about having to upgrade systems, having to replace them at some point. We would strongly recommend that if you're establishing a capital reserve to consider your fleet and your technology in capital reserve planning. Those are often left out because we think about facilities when we think about our property, but our infrastructure is quite broad, and technology today really is infrastructure. We are living in this moment where we have to have our technological infrastructure very robust to be able to go on as planned. So please consider that when you take this back to your finance committee. And Pam, I think we've got another polling question.
Yes, we do. We do have a polling question. Does your organization have a documented business continuity plan? A, yes. Yes, but it needs improvement. B, no. D, I don't know. So I'll give you a few moments to respond. To participate, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. And just as a reminder, if you'd like CPE for today's webcast, you'll need to respond to at least 3 of the polling questions that we have. So I'll leave it open for just a couple more seconds here. Wait for a couple more responses. And I think I'll go ahead and close the poll and let's see the results. Colleen, I'll turn it back over to you.
So this is interesting. We've put in I don't know as an answer because we thought that that might actually be the case. So it's good to see that only 13% of you don't know, but that's still quite a few. So for those of you that answered that, go back and ask some questions about whether you have a plan in place. And everyone else, good for being aware. Emily, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about planning.
So we've mentioned all the different reasons why we want to be doing these different types of planning. So operational priorities. This is where we're coming and drawing from hopefully our strategic plan. If you don't have a strategic plan, this might be a good time to think that one through. But using a strategic plan, connecting it to those essential services that you've identified to really drill down and think about what are your operational priorities and how do we kind of hold ourselves accountable as an organization we want to really think, the sequence of events, not only the activities, but the dependencies and resources, as mentioned earlier. We really want to equip leadership to make informed decisions, in a crisis. So right now we are thinking, we want to be responsive, not reactive in our, anytime there's a disruption. And so when we clearly identify what our operational priorities are, then it's much easier. We're all on the same page. There's not going to be 12 Zoom meetings discussing, well, what should we do next? What do we have to prioritize? If we go through this process of clearly identifying and prioritizing, then we will be able to respond more proactively and quickly and efficiently, rather than just react to, without that knowledge and that foundation. Thinking about the policies and procedures around continuity planning, this is really our governance model. This is the pieces that help us kind of keep on track, that guide what we do and make sure we're all on the same page. So, thinking about the overarching structure, the authority, special actions, how are we going to deal with circumstances that we didn't think of, really providing that framework for any continuity plan or contingency planning efforts that are going on. And really think about how you can leverage the other experts in the organization. Different groups think about risk all the time. Our jobs, we might not call it that, but we are managing risk every day in our jobs because there's just a lot of uncertainty. So we try to manage what we can when we can. But specifically for continuity planning, to really think about who is responsible for making sure that this plan doesn't sit on a shelf somewhere and never get used, and how are we going to kind of institutionalize it into our day-to-day practices. An important piece, obviously we're all experiencing this right now, is cash flow. If you haven't done this exercise yet, I would be surprised, but we're all looking at, what is our kind of financial position right now, and then build upon that. Think about how do we estimate our liquidity needs. So, how much readily accessible money do we have? And to think about those needs over multiple periods. So not just 30 days like on the slide, but it's 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. Just thinking about what are our regular expenses, what are our planned purchases, and then identifying some some cushion. We're not going to be able to predict it all, but we want to, try to give ourselves a good idea of, what are our obligations. And so with that kind of liquidity analysis, thinking about the cash flow projections over those same periods, and if you're going to be short, we really encourage you to talk with your creditors and lenders sooner rather than later. Be proactive. If you see a problem looming in 2-3 months, this is the time to proactively engage everyone that you can to problem solve and think creatively about, okay, what can we do differently going forward? What are the scenarios that we can consider for how to avoid a shortfall? When you're thinking about financial records within a continuity plan, I think this is, again, kind of to Colleen's point, we have some clients that are still very paper-based, and we really encourage you to just think about where are these documents that we may not need on a daily basis, but where are they being stored? Who can access them? If we can't get to them, what are the backups? How are we, how far back do we need to go? So we really encourage any continuity planning to consider those those pieces of, we just assume we can have access. That's not always the case. Purchasing. This is a big one right now. We see a lot of conversations about emergency procurement and kind of what is the best way to handle. So if you have a purchasing card program, are the current limits and signing authorities appropriate? We're testing this environment where, to really think about who needs to buy what and how to not just do the day-to-day, but what are the instances where you might have to, like Colleen mentioned, buy new technologies. How are we ensuring that purchases are made still in compliance with our purchasing policies and procedures, but that they are flexible enough to allow us to respond, again, appropriately, no matter what the crisis might be. Vendor contracts are a huge part of the purchasing planning as well. If we don't know who our key vendors are and who we rely on, we're missing a big piece of it. Thinking about who do we depend on? Our banks, our financial institutions, our IT, outsourced IT, building contractors, fuel companies, facility maintenance. We're really experiencing, some true disruptions across industries. And so if you haven't yet, make sure you capture any pain points that you've had so that you can plan better going forward, so that you can think about how do we leverage vendors differently, looking at the creative shift that a lot of retailers have made or manufacturers to fill needs, to really have those conversations and think about it in, do we have the right terms in our contracts? Are we looking at a vendor's continuity plan regularly? Because if we rely on them heavily, then we should know that they're doing this planning process too. It really feeds into the technology area that we are experiencing this in a whole new way. We've had to ramp up our hardware and software investments, and we've experienced outages. We haven't been able to buy items when they're out of stock, or there's been a backlog for services. So really to think about, again, lessons learned from this example of the COVID-19 experience, but also to think about who can we collaborate with and pull resources with. Do we have to have our own service agreement, or can we partner with others? Thinking of those through, and again, I think we're seeing a lot of creativity and solutions that are kind of currently emerging right now. Our payroll considerations obviously are at the forefront of our experience right now. It's really this is an ongoing question that probably all of you are experiencing right now. How long are we going to pay? How are we using sick time and vacation time? What are the union and contract considerations? To really think about that, those pieces where we, again, if you haven't defined these, to really think about how do we capture the lessons learned. A lot of places that depend on physical checks have had to think about how to do things differently. I know there are some places that have just switched over that's no longer an option. We do want to be considerate of, if there are folks that would be a hindrance for, but really just thinking about what are our policies and procedures in these different areas, whether that's advances, loans, how does overtime work, and just thinking about how employees can continue to work and add value to the organization, even if their normal job might be disrupted. And of course, our people are most important investment. So really to think about what are the resources that we can provide to our employees, to our staff during any sort of disruption. So transportation, if you're even willing and able to work, can you get to work if it requires you to be on site? Obviously, the health and safety concerns have to be number one. And, then there's the long-term consequences, especially like we're experiencing now. There's going to be, mental health concerns and productivity and performance that needs to be managed. And, we have to think about what the cost is if we don't address those. The real loss in productivity because folks are burning out or depressed or, feeling unsupported by an organization. Those have bottom line implications. Like there are true costs if we don't proactively think about how we support our employees in these times. And with that, Pam, it looks like we have another poll.
Yes, we do. The next polling question we have is, does your organization have backup staff identified for critical functions? Yes for all. B, yes for some. C, no. D, I don't know. And again, I'll give you a few moments to respond. And just as a reminder to participate, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. Also, for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts to the right of the slide view. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast. So I'll leave the poll open just a few more seconds, so hopefully you'll have a chance to respond. I'll just wait for a couple more responses. And I'll close it here in a All right, I'll close the poll, and here are the results.
All right, thanks, Pam. So I think this is a polling question that probably if we had asked it 3 months ago, might have had a really different response. So it's good to see that really the vast majority of you have at least some backup staff identified for those critical functions. I'm going to cover 2 more areas that we consider financial preparedness that might not be typically when you think about finance or operations in the finance department as financial, but actually really impact an organization financially. So the first is deferred maintenance. And as I mentioned earlier, we really tend to put off repairs and we wait until our systems fail to replace them. But during continuity planning, we need to face what we have put off. It's really important to assess your facilities, your equipment, your vehicles, your technology, identify where there might be deferred maintenance, and then if an emergency would increase the impact of that system or facility or property failing to your organization. We always know that if we've been putting some things off, that's a higher source of potential failure during a crisis. So for each asset, really consider what's the likelihood of this failing during an event, and then what could the potential cost or delay be of getting maintenance or repair work done. So, whether or not, for example, a plumber is available to come to your home in the case of a pandemic is really something to consider at a personal level. If we kind of level that up to the organization, that's the type of lens that you should approach deferred maintenance with. And then finally, we have insurance. So we're not insurance experts, but insurance can play a really big role in how you recover from or simply operate during an emergency. We would really recommend during continuity planning to meet with your insurance provider and talk to them about this. So say, I'm going through a continuity planning process. I'm thinking about these specific scenarios. What position do you think you would be in? I know that we've all learned recently that, global health crises are typically not covered under insurance policies. And so thinking about, okay, how are we going to deal with these particular different scenarios? We also really highly recommend compiling all of your policies and storing them off-site. We would absolutely recommend on an annual basis at least going through that list of policies, making sure everything is up to date, making sure you've got the right contact information for folks, and really making sure that there is a secure copy stored somewhere else in case your office is unavailable. And when we talk about insurance, we also want to talk about being prepared to be reimbursed fully by your insurance. In the case of damage to facilities and property, especially, we have to have the proper records in place to ensure that we can be reimbursed. We've heard horror stories from lots of folks about, a natural disaster and not having the right documentation, and so then really not being able to be reimbursed by that. So we recommend putting together a detailed inventory of your assets. It doesn't take very long to take a video tour of your office now. Collecting any historical purchase documentation you might have, or if your assets are depreciated, making sure that you've got those records and that they're up to date. Identify all of those damaged items and things that are destroyed so that your insurance company can really be prepared to reimburse you. Likewise, we can prepare to be reimbursed by the government. The FEMA Public Assistance Grant Program is just one program. We thought we would highlight it because we knew there would be quite a few nonprofit and government folks on the webinar today. This is just one program, but the guidelines are pretty universal. The two most important things are timely submission of the request for public assistance. Probably everyone is quite aware based on the stimulus packages that have come out. Timely submission is really, really important. The second is having that, again, that complete and accurate documentation. So if, for example, there's a flood and you are making sure that you can get reimbursed for all of the project-related costs to your facilities, you've really got to have that documentation of all of those costs because they will absolutely not reimburse you without that receipt. And now I'm going to hand it over to Emily.
As we get near the end of our time, I just want to talk about some of the ways that we can assess our current levels of preparedness and what we might do differently as we continue to go forward. So there's all the areas that we've covered. We've talked about many of these on this list. But what we really, I really want to just stress a few key points. I think what we're all experiencing and what our clients are sharing is that we really have to think both short-term and long-term when we're looking at our preparedness levels. There's, no longer just thinking about it a few days or even a week. We're now looking at, what are the longer-term scenarios that we have to prepare for. And so key part of that is cash flow forecasting and monitoring, like I mentioned earlier, and just really thinking about how do we have timely, accurate, and understandable information across these different areas to think about what are our key indicators of performance for you as an organization. And so if you're not currently thinking about these different areas in terms of either cost or practices, this is the time to really have those discussions and think about, what are our practices in place in these different areas? What are our, communication and program costs? How are we putting all these pieces together to make us who we are as an organization? So thinking about engaging third-party vendors, make other people do work for you is a really great piece of advice I've been given many times, but learn from other people's experience. Think about what are we going to be able to ask from our vendors. So if you have an IT data backup provider, to really ask them what are their contingency plans? How are they going to provide services in the event of a disruption? Making sure we ask them to provide their plans and thinking about how to integrate these. Timely supply chain, again, that's a huge piece. I just want to emphasize that, really thinking about how can we inventory what we need, what are the things that we depend on a normal, during normal operations, and if we identify that, it's much easier to then prioritize what we need to shore up and what we have to prioritize if there are limited supplies. Other ways you can assess your preparedness are to do operational audits, looking at the practices, for example, in purchasing. Procurement and contracting, those are areas that we often see a lot of pain points. And they can be really strategic roles for an organization, and they often get a bad rap. So we want to encourage you to look at the purchasing practices, whether that's, what are our contract terms? Do we have flexibility in payment schedules? And how are we setting up the obligations in the event of a disruption with whatever contracts we might be establishing or entering into? Purchasing practices can add up if we're in a decentralized model. If we have a lot of different purchasing activity across the organization, we really want to make sure that we have strong authority and oversight. It doesn't mean that you can't do a decentralized model, but we really encourage you to make sure that you're getting the right data out of those scattered positions so that someone is looking at how are we using our purchasing power as an organization as efficiently and effectively as we can. Thinking about our risk management practices as well. What are our compliance elements that might not be critical in the first week or two, but if we aren't in a place where we can track what needs to happen and that longer term thinking, we run the risk of being non-compliant and then facing additional fees and fines, which after a disruption we definitely don't want to do. Finally, just to wrap up, again, we are planning to manage the risks that we are aware of. We do have to leave some cushion as much as possible to manage the unexpected and avoidable costs that might arise. To thinking about, as Colleen mentioned, the reserve policies, how do we give ourselves a surge capacity, as it were, to strengthen our financial position, both in the event of a crisis and in that recovery period as well, when things might not be the same as they were. So not thinking that we can necessarily always return to our prior normal, but how do we position ourselves to be as successful as we can going forward in a new normal. And with that, I think we have our final polling question.
Yes, thanks, Emily. So here's our final polling question. What is your organization's most vulnerable preparedness area? Facilities and equipment, third parties and supply chain, IT systems and data critical records, reserves and cash flow, process documentation and staffing, or is it something else? We have another option here as well. Again, I'll leave the poll questions open for a couple of seconds. To participate, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. Since this is our last polling question for today's webcast, once you have completed all CPE requirements, you'll be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. But if you have any issues, we will be sending an email with your CPE certificate as well. All right, I'm just going to wait for a couple more responses, and then I'll close the poll. All right, I'll go ahead and close it. Here are the results.
All right, thanks, Pam. So we see systems, cash, and people, which is definitely not a surprise. So I am going to spend the last couple of minutes talking about kind of the fun part, which is ensuring that your continuity plans and procedures are viable, which means they have to be tested, they have to be evaluated, and they have to be refined. And right now we're actually kind of in a giant test of business continuity and getting lessons learned from COVID-19. And this is going to involve really revisiting our plans or creating some plans, revisiting our procedures, and really assessing the state of our preparedness when we're able to take a step back and do lessons learned. So when we're testing and exercising, we assign roles to everyone. Those of you in local government are probably familiar with the hats that can be worn in a local emergency operations center that identify who's in a key role. But really in any testing or training event, we want to identify the levels and types of authority. We want to cross-train so our staff is flexible and really build skills across discipline. A very important note when testing continuity is to always assign a historian or a record keeper to identify what happened so that we can learn from our experiences. We've seen lots of folks go through a testing process, and then without a record keeper, we're all just relying on our memory and maybe not getting to the most effective way to really capture our lessons learned. We can probably all identify when we think about our organization who our key decision makers are. So it might be our executive director or our president, it might be the board, it might be the guy who orders the coffee, but authority can really fly out the window in an emergency. So when we test continuity, we want to identify those key positions for essential functions, identify who could be the suitable substitute personnel, and train them all. We want to establish a line of succession for the highest positions of authority and key leadership roles, and make sure that we note that by position and not individual, because over the course of a year, if you haven't looked at your continuity plan, those individuals might change. So really thinking about the roles in our organization, and if we restructure, making sure to look at our plan and making sure that titles and roles line up. We should also consider who has legal authority for policy and fiscal decisions that might be necessary, how that authority might be delegated in an emergency, the limits it might have, accountability mechanisms, when the authority might be terminated. We don't want to give someone emergency purchasing authority and then realize 6 months later that they still have that authority. We really want to get kind of a handle on what that is. Finally, our advice would be to really think about your plan in terms of providing summary guidance and things that are really easily accessible to everyone who needs it. So not everyone will need to access the whole plan all the time, but if we've got some pocket guides, some checklists, and some summaries, and then we've got reminders of where the details are for those tactical needs, we can really keep everyone in our organization aware. So closing comment is really thinking about business continuity like insurance. It's an investment in risk mitigation, and the absence of business continuity planning exposes us to risk and liability. So we should keep our plans living documents through training, testing, and exercising. We should make sure that our plans are easy to use and maintain, and we should try to institutionalize them as much as possible. We should make sure that we put some budget toward our planning so that we're able to maintain plans that we can actually use. And then finally, implement a process of change management so that we can really maintain our plans and that they're effective. So just to show you a couple of things, if you're able to download the slides, we did provide quite a few resources. We also just wanted to point out a great resource is your local emergency management office, as well as your local public works department. We also find that in states where they have frequent natural disasters, so a place like Florida that has a lot of hurricanes, their local emergency management offices and state offices also have great guidance. So those are great places to look if you don't find your own local office to be as prepared as you would like. And with that, I will wrap us up. I'm sorry we do not have time for Q&A today, but our contact information is in the slide deck. And we just wanted to say thank you very much for coming. And Pam, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Colleen and Emily, for a great presentation today. Like Colleen mentioned, unfortunately we're out of time today. But if you submitted a question in the Q&A inbox, we'll be sure to connect with you to answer your questions. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. But again, a copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. And then finally, here's a survey link where you can provide feedback for today's presentation, or maybe even send us some additional suggestions for future topics you'd like us to cover. We hope you complete the survey, as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.